Hi, it's Heather from Thicketworks. Today I'm going to demonstrate how to construct these 1/12 scale Gothic cabinets. This miniature SVG bundle is available as an instant download via the Thicketworks Studio shop. There's a link in the description. This rich finish is created using bronze powder inlays. Layers of cardstock cut in intricate patterns on the Cricut Maker create the perfect vehicle for this ageless technique. This finish is my personal favorite. However, a set of mini furniture stencils is included in this bundle so that you can approach the finish in an entirely different fashion. In this example, metallic texture paste is used to create a raised version of the same design. However you choose to finish your pieces, the important thing is to have fun. So let's get started. Once you've cut all the components from lightweight chipboard, you'll have an array that looks like this. To begin with, we have the back panels, the top and bottom panels and side panels, the cabinet door panels, front and back and side base panels, and a base panel spacer, molding frames in 2 separate sizes, and a shelf plus door stops and shelf supports. I also recommend hanging on to several of these little rectangles that are generated when you cut out the molding frames. The first step in this project is to laminate together the multiple layers that will make up each of these components. There are 3 layers each for the back panels, the side and top and bottom panels. To make that process a little easier, you might want to set up a jig like I have here that allows me to align things in a perfect 90-degree angle. That makes it much easier. I'm choosing to use a solvent-based adhesive for this process, but a PVA glue would work just as well. It simply takes longer to cure. Having this right angle jig set up really improved the speed of the process for me this time. I'm going to continue to use this type of jig in future projects. It really helped tremendously. Now here are the side panels. So you have 2 sets of 3 each, which get laminated together. So you'll end up with 2 separate side panels, each consisting of 3 layers. The top and bottom panels are created precisely the same way. Again, we have 3 layers of lightweight chipboard that are laminated together. The important thing here is to make certain that the little holes in the leading edge don't become clogged with whatever adhesive you're using. And finally, here are the cabinet doors, each consisting of 3 layers. The shelf and doorstop panels consist of 2 layers each, as do the shelf supports. Next, I'm going to put together the side panels for the base of the cabinet. Each of these little panels consists of 3 layers. So for each cabinet that you create, you'll need 2 of these 3-layer panels. For the front and the back base panel, it's precisely the same construction method. 3 layers lined up to the best of your ability and laminated together. This 3-layer rectangle serves as a spacer and also as a shelf at the bottom of the unit. It lends a great deal of stability to the entire piece. Now I'm going to begin constructing the molding frames. There are 2 sizes of these broken into layers of 4. Right now I'm working on the smaller of the two sizes. We're creating molding frames for both the top and the bottom of the main cabinet carcass here. I'm just using PVA glue to layer together these 4 pieces of chipboard. And you'll see eventually they'll get layered on top of the larger frame pieces. Again, there are 4 layers of each of these little frames. So that's the smaller of the frames constructed. And now I'm going to glue together the 4 layers that create the first of the larger frames. Now once that's constructed, it's time to work on this alignment panel. So this consists of 2 plain molding frames, which are laminated together. And then on top of that, we're going to be adding these additional frames that have the little construction slots. I'm smoothing out the PVA here before applying the first of the construction slot layers to minimize the amount of squeeze out between the layers. I want to make sure that the construction slots stay as free of obstruction as possible. That's why I'm being a little finicky here with a brush and making sure that the PVA gets smoothed out to the best of my ability. Once all the components have been laminated and have had time to cure, I like to sand the edges. Now I've affixed 2 grits of sandpaper to either side of this little flat board, and I'm going to gang up these components, which all share the same outside dimensions, and I'm going to sand those flat edges as smooth as I possibly can. My goal here is to reduce the amount of striations that are visible in the finished piece. And sanding is your best friend when it comes to that aspect. I'm sanding all the flat edges here, and now I'm going to work on some of the curved shapes by using this little electric nail drill. I've got it fitted with a ceramic bit that has a cylindrical shape, which makes it perfect for smoothing out these very soft curves. You certainly don't have to use one of these little electric nail drills. Goodness knows I've done plenty of projects without them, but since having added it to my list of tools, I don't think I'll ever go back. It's incredibly helpful. Now that the preliminary sanding has been taken care of, it's time to harden these pieces. Now, this is optional, but I highly recommend it. The process means impregnating the surface of all of these little chipboard pieces with super glue. I'm working on top of a non-stick craft mat, and I like to use little pieces of plastic card to help smooth the super glue into the surface of the chipboard. I use a very thin super glue. This one by Starbond is one of my all-time favorites, and it penetrates quite deeply into the fibers. The reason that I like this process so much and recommend it is that it's the very next best thing to working with wood. For constructing miniatures, I really prefer working with chipboard because we can cut relatively intricate shapes from it with very little difficulty on the Cricut Maker. Once all of your pieces have been hardened, you have a decision to make. What kind of finish do you choose to put on your cabinet? If you're interested in trying out the bronze powder inlay technique, you'll want to cut all of these overlay panels out of high quality cardstock, because that's what we will use in order to create the framework for the inlay. And that results in that finish. However, if you'd like to take a simpler and frankly, less work-intensive approach, you can opt to use these little stencils that have been designed to work with the pieces in this kit. Each stencil has registration marks at the 4 corners and will help you achieve a finish that looks like this one. And this is the finish that I'll be demonstrating first. You need to select a background color of your choosing. Now, my eye is very pleased by this soft dove gray. I can't tell you where you can find this exact craft paint because frankly, I purchased it over 30 years ago. Yeah, I hoard and hold on to craft supplies for decades. And if you've developed a full-blown crafting obsession like I have, so will you. The painting process is, of course, incredibly straightforward. The important thing is to try to minimize the amount of paint buildup that you get at the edges of the little tabs and slots, because that will make constructing the piece more difficult in the long run. So keep an eye on that and smooth out the surfaces. Here I'm using a 220 grit. I'm careful to wipe off as much of the resulting sanding dust as possible before moving on to the next phase, which involves using these little stencils. Now, mine are slightly stained because, as you can imagine, I've been making prototypes. But to give you an idea of how they function, you'll see that there are pieces that have been designed for specific components here. The idea behind creating these little stencils is to give you the option to create a relatively ornate surface with very little effort. This design is intended for the exterior sidewalls of the cabinet. This design will enhance the lower side panels, and it has a little arrow to help you orient up from down. This design will create a beautiful effect on the cabinet doors. This one is for the base of the front, and it also has a little orienting arrow at the top. And the final stencil is so that you can embellish the back of the piece if you choose to. Now, you can, of course, cut your stencils from reusable adhesive vinyl. I'm using this clear stencil film because it makes me feel more confident about being able to place the stencils properly on each component. But I'm also going to be adding a thin layer of Aleene's Tack It Over and Over onto one side of the stencil to minimize bleed, and also to help hold these tiny stencils in place while applying the texture paste. You could skip this altogether, or if you prefer, you could use a repositionable spray adhesive for this step. I've allowed the adhesive to cure, and now I'm going to place my first component onto the stencil. This stencil has been designed to work together with the design on the front of the cabinet. And so I'm positioning the leading or flat edge against the edge of the stencil with the large flourish motif. I'm using those registration marks in the corners to help me align this panel, and then I'm going to press it into place. I'm going to look at it from a couple of angles to make sure it's correct, and when I'm happy with the placement, I will press it very firmly down so that we won't have any bleed through. Now, I'm using a do-it-yourself metallic texture paste, and if you want the recipe for this, there's a link in the description to the blog post on the Graphics Fairy where I introduced this recipe. I love this stuff, and I'm happy to report that if you keep it in a well-sealed container, it has a shelf life of at least 5 years. I'm being a bit finicky about the application here because in the long run, the smoothness that you achieve at this point is going to be reflected on your final piece. So it's important to get as smooth a surface in the texture paste at this point as you possibly can. This texture paste is so much fun to work with, but it's not very sandable. So that's why I'm stressing getting the smoothest possible surface at this point. Peeling away the stencil is a little tricky, but it just takes some patience. And there we go. Perfectly positioned. Now, the thing about this paste is that it is incredibly durable and tough, and so I do have to wash my stencil between each application. Now it's time to repeat the process for the other side panel. And again, I'm making sure that I'm aligning the leading or flat edge with that large flourish motif, and then using the registration marks at the corners to help me align the stencil to this tiny little panel. Once I'm happy with the placement, I press it down extremely firmly. If you choose to make this metallic paste for yourself, you are going to fall in love with it. It has so many uses. And there we go. Component number 2 is now complete. The next piece I'm going to work on is the bottom spacer panel, or the bottom shelf. Now, it's entirely optional. You don't have to do this, but I wanted a really special surface to show through the bottom of the cabinet. So that's why I've chosen to add this motif onto that panel. Next, I'm going to work on the back panel. And again, you certainly don't have to, but I want the piece to look good from every angle. So I'm going to orient this so that I can press the back panel onto the sticky side of the stencil. Again, using the registration marks in the corners to help me get everything aligned properly. When I'm happy with the placement, I'm actually going to reinforce this by using a brayer. And then gently lift the little sandwich here and flip it over. Verify that everything looks proper and apply the brayer one more time. This metallic gel is a joy to work with. I just can't get over how smooth and creamy the consistency is. I like using this large scale palette knife with a nice flat edge. It helps me get a more consistent finish. It's important to clean off the palette knife with a damp rag to prevent the texture paste from building up onto the surface. And I haven't mentioned it, but you're watching me remove this stencil while the product is still extremely fresh. And that's important. If you allowed it to dry in place and then attempted to remove the stencil, you'd have a little wrestling match on your hands. So don't do that. There's a specific orientation for this component, the front of the base. And so I'm making sure that I'm lining it up and have the little arrow pointing upwards. It's just so satisfying to remove these stencils and see the glorious metallic gleam of that metallic gel paste. I just love the way it looks. So rich and so easy to do. Now it's time to do the side panels for the base, and they too have a distinct orientation. So make sure you're aware of where that arrow is pointing upward and that that aligns with the upper portion of this panel. Oh, there comes the reveal. It's just so fun. And here's this second side panel for the base. Now, the last piece that needs to be stenciled are the doors, and I've just joined them together using a piece of transparent tape on the back side. That way, the stencil lines up perfectly with the motif balanced between the two doors. Now, because this is the most prominent part of the piece, I want to make sure that my application is as smooth as I can possibly get it, and I'm very, very careful as I remove the stencil. I don't want to smear it. However, if you do smear any of this while you're busy working on it, don't worry, you can simply scrape it off, let the surface dry, and then apply your paint again and give it another go. At the end of the day, once it's had a chance to cure, it is the most beautiful and durable finish for the least amount of effort that I can recommend. So have fun with this one. A quick wipe down with isopropyl alcohol is going to remove any residual adhesive from my work surface. Now, unfortunately, the footage got lost, but what you see me doing here is neatening up the edge of a panel consisting of 8 layers of those interior rectangles that are created as we cut these framing components. And the reason that I'm doing that is so that I can fit these two pieces together in perfect alignment without having to just eyeball it. By placing this stack between the two pieces, I know that everything is lining up exactly right. It's not required, but it helped me in my process, and I thought I'd share it with you. This is the set of molding frames that contain the little construction slots, and that will help us to align the base component when the time comes to construct everything. Now, again, this isn't necessary, but I thought it would be fun to add a little touch of metallic gleam to the edge of the components that are going to be visible in the final piece. So I'm using this same texture paste that we've used all along, and I'm just applying it sparingly using a small scale sponge applicator. And that works great. I try to be mindful of any over application. I really don't want the gel to show on the flat surfaces, so I'm wiping it away with my fingertips as I notice it so that I can minimize any staining that it might produce on that gray finish. I'm not so worried about the interior, but I still want to wipe away any excess that accumulates there. I'm wiping my finger off on a damp rag that is off the edge of the screen, but that helps me to not continually recontaminate the surface that I'm trying to clean. All of the raised stenciling has cured, and now I'm gently removing the transparent tape from the back of the cabinet doors. It's time to do an initial dry fit prior to constructing the carcass of the cabinet. So to verify whether or not things are fitting properly, I fit them together against a flat surface. And if there's any binding, that's easily taken care of by the judicious application of a needle file or an emery board to help neaten up all of those edges. I want the final piece to be as well constructed as possible, so taking the time to clean up these edges at this stage of the process ultimately makes my life easier in the long run. Okay, now that I've done a little bit of cleanup, I'm going to dry fit these edges again and see if that fit has improved. And it has. Things are looking pretty good. Those are the side panels. And here we go with the top and the bottom panels. It fits pretty tightly, but I think it's going to be just fine. Yep, I'd say we're ready to begin the gluing process. Now, I want mine oriented with those pointy ends of that motif in the vertical position. So I'm paying attention to that before I begin to apply glue to what will be the top edge of the cabinet. And then I'm placing the top panel against it and pressing everything into place. I'm using one of these little silicone tools to help me clean up any of the glue that is extruded when I press those pieces together. And now I'm adding one of the side panels. Now this is a little tricky because you're fitting together not only the back panel plus the side panel, but the side panel also fits together with the top panel at that corner. So you have a few edges to keep track of simultaneously here. Just verifying that everything is square and true, and then getting rid of that glue squeeze out. Yep, that's looking pretty good. Now I'm going to be adding the other side panel. It's important to construct it in this order so that you have the ability to fit your cabinet doors into place properly. You do not want to place the bottom panel just yet. Before we button up this cabinet and place those cabinet doors, there are some interior panels that should be added. Now, depending on the tightness of the construction, you may or may not want to add one thin layer of these cardstock rectangles on either side of the interior in order to make the space slightly narrower. For me, in this particular construction, that worked out really well. I didn't require that on the next piece that I built, so it really has to do with the individuality of the piece. Just know that if your shelf component is not fitting snugly between the walls, it's really easy to just add that single layer on either side, and that will take care of the problem. And once you've done that, it's time to begin installing the door stops, and one of those goes against the top panel like you see me installing here, and you just butt it up against the very back panel of the cabinet. That ensures that you have plenty of room between the front edge and the front edge of the cabinet proper, and that will hold your doors perfectly at the correct level when they're closed. See, it creates just this tiny ridge against which the top of the doors can rest. You'll also be using another one of these doorstop panels against the bottom panel, which is not yet installed. And this is a little trickier because you have to line it up sort of by eye rather than by butting it against the back wall. Just give yourself some time and slide it into place. Make certain that you're not obscuring the holes. Okay, so this is our top, and those two holes are vital because they hold the top spindle of each of the doors. You'll see those little nubs fit right into that hole. Put one on either side, and now comes the very trickiest part, which is getting everything to line up simultaneously, including the little nubs at the bottom of each door. So I'm placing a generous application of PVA. I'm making sure I'm oriented correctly here, and I'm just beginning the finicky process of fitting that panel onto the back wall, the side walls, and the little nubbin at the base of the door simultaneously. It takes some doing, but with a little patience and just a small amount of manual dexterity, it's possible to make it all work. Once the bottom panel is installed and the doors are working, just verify that all of the other connections have remained secure and that the doors will open and close freely. Now at this point, I'm installing what I call the shelf supports, one on either side. It gets butted up against the bottom of the unit, and these act to support the shelf on either side. So it's pretty simple, just glue them in place. Now if your doors don't close all the way because they're slightly too wide, don't be concerned at this point. The addition of paint layers has added to their width, and it's created that issue. Some judicious sanding at the right time will take care of it, and I promise you they are going to close perfectly. The alignment is just beautiful when it all comes together. Now I'm just adding some PVA to the top of the shelf supports, and then making sure that the notched edge is facing forward. I'm sliding the shelf into place against the top of those supports and then pressing down. That'll be very secure once the PVA sets up. I'm just verifying that the door closes properly with the shelf installed, and this is optional, but I'm going to put a vertical support in the center for visual interest as much as anything else. This just gets lined up by eye. I wanted mine to fall directly in the center where the doors close. Now we're going to follow the same exact process for the base components. So after a dry fit, make sure that everything comes together easily, and if it doesn't, take a few moments to clean up those edges with a needle file or an emery board. Once you've verified that everything dry fits together, you can begin the glue up process, and I recommend doing this in 2 stages. In other words, I take one of the base panels that is wide and I connect it with one of the side panels, which is narrow, and I allow those 2 pieces to cure. And once they have, then I have 2 halves of the bottom that can be joined together. You'll see what I mean in just a moment. So here's the first front and side panel being joined together. And I'm just using 1, 2, 3 blocks to help align everything at a perfect 90-degree angle. While those set up, I'm going to take care of that problem with the edge of the doors. There's just a tiny bit of sanding that needs to take place here. And of course, we have to be gentle because of the nature of the piece. But at the same time, we need to remove enough material so that the piece will actually function as designed. So go slowly, remove a little bit at a time, and continually test it by closing the doors. It's okay to go slow. In fact, with a process like this, I think it's necessary. So just take your time and be as mindful as you can not to remove too much material. It's such a satisfying moment when they finally fit flush. I just love that. It's priceless. Once you get to this stage, it's going to be almost impossible to resist playing with the piece, I promise you. However, we have work to do. Now that these 2 base components have had an opportunity to cure, it's time to join them together. Apply PVA glue along one of the wide base panels and the edge of the narrow panel, and then just slide the pieces together. Press them firmly into place and do your best to remove any of the glue squeeze out. Now, until we install the bottom spacer or the shelf that goes at the bottom of the piece, it's still relatively fragile, especially where you see those thin cross pieces. So take care not to put too much pressure on it yet. The next thing we'll do is fit the bottom pieces into this component that has the little construction slots. Add a generous amount of your preferred adhesive to both surfaces and then line them up and press into place. Again, put some firm pressure, but not so much pressure that you cause the piece to buckle. Remove the glue squeeze out, verifying that everything's fitting together properly along the way. There. Once that's had a chance to set up, we can install the bottom shelf. This component is basically a pressure fit. So gently angle it and slide it into place. I wanted mine to be flush with the top of those cross pieces. So that's how I've positioned it. But you can place it at whatever height makes sense to you. And then applying PVA glue only to the exterior and trusting that between the pressure fit and this small amount of adhesive, everything's going to remain sturdy. Now the piece is going to be much stronger. Strong enough, in fact, that I can now place multiple 1, 2, 3 blocks on top of it in order to help it cure straight and true. The next phase of this project is creating the door hardware, and this begins with the process of laminating together 2 layers of the large escutcheon plate. That's what I'm doing here. I've just glued 2 layers together, and you can see that they are pierced by a hole at either end, and that is decorative, but it also helps with the construction process so that it's easier to line everything up. Now again, you can use whatever adhesive makes the most sense to you. Here I'm using a watered down version of Aleene's tacky glue, and this little gem picker pen is invaluable when working with these absolutely tiny pieces of paper, as is this needle tool. So I use the needle tool to pierce through where the holes appear at one end of the small escutcheon plate. I line that up, and once it's adhered, I line up the other end by piercing through that set of holes. So we're making 2 sets of escutcheon plates for each of the door handles, 1 large and 1 small. Now that we have the large escutcheon plate, we're going to layer the smaller version on top of it to make a 2-tiered structure. It's rather difficult to see here, for which I apologize, and the handles themselves are created from 2 layers of cardstock. These little handles are so cute, and I know you're going to find many ways to use them, not just in this project, but in a lot of other miniature projects as well. They're so tiny. Once everything's put together, they measure roughly 13/16 of an inch long, and the whole construction, including the escutcheon plates, is about 3/16 of an inch wide. Dainty enough to fit on the most delicate of your 1/12 scale miniatures. The process for gluing the handles together is the same as it is for the escutcheon plates. You line up the holes, get one end situated, make sure that it's sturdy, pinch together the 2 layers, remove the needle tool from one end and place it in the other end to make sure everything is aligned. use your fine-tipped tweezers to clamp everything down. And if someone as awkward as I am can do this, I guarantee you, you can do it too. Repeat this process for the other handle. Hold it steady using the tip of your needle tool. Apply your adhesive to one of the handle parts. Use a tool to pick up the other. Do your best to center it over the top, and using the needle tool and the hole at one end, help to align both the pieces. Once that's done, you can begin to clamp them down using your fine-tipped tweezers. Once the first end is complete, line up the hole on the other end to help the alignment, and go ahead and squeeze everything together so that it's firmly adhered. Okay, so that's phase one complete. Now we're going to shape the individual handles. And for this, I use a cylindrical tool to round the shape of the handle. I found that the simplest method was to just rotate the piece back and forth against the pad of my index finger. Oh, these little things are so fiddly. Alright, so that's one down, and here's the second one. I begin in the center, and then roll the tool from one side to the other until you create roughly a stirrup shape. And once that's complete, we're going to bend back these tiny ends. Grasp it firmly with your tweezer tip, and then fold it backward. So you're creating a right angle at the end of that long curve. Repeat the same process at the other end of the handle. And there. Now I'll do the same thing with the other handle, of course. Grasping it firmly, and then bending back that little flange at each end. Once the handles are shaped, they can be mounted onto the escutcheon plate. Place a drop of adhesive at either end of the plate, and then pick up your shaped handle and gently place it into the adhesive. At this point, I like to pierce through all of the holes, that in the shaped handle and also those that are in the plate itself. And that gives me a relatively firm basis for being able to clamp down with the tip of my tweezers to help it adhere at one end. Once the first end is relatively firmly in place, you can repeat the process at the other end of the handle. Gently remove the needle tool and then insert it into the other end and go about the business of clamping down on that part of the construction. Once these have set up, it's a good idea to add a drop of super glue to each of the handle assemblies. That will help them to withstand any handling of the miniature. It's surprising how just 2 layers of cardstock on these little handles can be so tough, but I promise I have played with these handles over and over again and have not had any problems. One of the things that I really love about this project is that I worked hard to make sure we wouldn't need any external hardware. In other words, you don't have to add any hinges. You don't even really have to construct any hinges. They're part of the initial design. And using these little bespoke handles made out of paper makes it possible for you to customize them any way that you would like, add whatever kind of finishes you would like, use whatever type of paper suits your fancy. I just love the fact that everything you need for this to be a functioning miniature is included in the SVG bundle. I don't know that I'll ever get over my initial astonishment at the delicacy of which the Cricut Maker is capable. It's a dream come true to me to be able to have precision cut pieces at this scale at the push of a button. It's amazing that from simple cardstock and chipboard, I have the ability to create miniatures of which I could only dream before. While the handle assemblies are curing, I'll take a few moments to do a final cleanup pass on all the edges of the miniature. I'm just using emery boards and needle files to make sure that all of the surfaces feel nice and smooth. I find that it's easier to add finishes to small pieces like these handles by temporarily affixing them to a substrate. I've just grabbed a scrap of chipboard here and I've temporarily glued them down. That makes it easier to apply finishes. I've decided I want a really delicate look for this particular version of the cabinet, so I'm using the same color that appears in the background of the cabinet as a base color. I just want to make sure that I apply the paint carefully and don't leave drips and gobs that might obscure some of the delicate details. I love the way that you can see not only the curves but the layers emerge as the lighter color is added. The detail is just delightful to me. Once that has dried, I'm using our metallic gel to add very subtle details of gold. I don't want it to look gaudy, but I do want it to harmonize with the rich finish on the rest of the piece. It was important to me to call attention to all of the details in these tiny constructions, and so I'm taking my time and applying very small amounts of gold around not only the handle itself, but also the edges of the escutcheon plates. I would like all of those layers to be subtly gleaming as your eye travels over them. A touch of detailing with the metallics, and the handles are complete. I love the way they've turned out. To seal and protect these tiny handles, I'll be adding a layer of glossy accents. Any clear coat that you have on hand should be appropriate for this task. The handles are gently removed from the supporting substrate using a thin blade. And now it's finally time to install them. Now I am doing this while one of the doors is open so that I can verify that as I install this first handle, it's not extending beyond the edge of the door in any way. The tolerances here are very fine, and the handles are designed to float right at the edge of the doors. While the handles are curing in place, I've centered the carcass of the cabinet on the lower portion of the piece, and I'm allowing that to cure with weight on top. Once it has cured, it's time to install the final molding around the very upper edge of the cabinet. I've used an adhesive here that allows me to have a little bit of working time so that I can verify that I have what appears to me to be the correct amount of reveal on all sides of the cabinet as I turn it from one side to the other. And I do my best to make certain that that molding is centered. Once I'm happy, it's time to place weights on it and allow it to cure. And that, my friends, is how this first version of our tiny, elaborate medieval cabinet is created. For those of you who wish to explore the creation of the next version of the cabinet, stay tuned, because we're going to experiment with creating that real metal powder inlay used in conjunction with these cardstock overlay panels. Once again, this right angle gluing jig is a huge assistant during this process. I've chosen to layer together 3 of each of these overlay panels, and the adhesive that I chose for this depended mainly on the delicacy with which it could be applied. That allowed me to place adhesive everywhere it needed to go around these delicate designs without creating a huge mess. So the first 2 layers have been laminated, and now with the Zig 2-way glue pen, I'm adding an additional layer of adhesive, and we'll mount that 3rd cutout layer right on top, doing my very best to align all of these delicate motifs. It's not perfect, but it will serve perfectly for the purpose for which it was designed, and that is to cover the back panel completely, leaving a void where the bronze powder can be applied and hardened. This same process is followed for all of the exterior panels. Layers of 3 are laminated together, taking care to align all of the delicate motifs. Once these overlay panels have had an opportunity to cure, it's time to affix them to the underlying chipboard structural pieces. Here, PVA glue is applied to the chipboard. The pieces are oriented correctly, and the overlay panel is then pressed into place. This process is repeated for all of the overlay panels and underlying chipboard structural pieces. It's a good idea to place these panels underneath weights while they cure to minimize any warping that might occur because of the water content in the PVA glue. Once the cardstock overlay panels have cured, it's time to apply the hardening process. Hardening with superglue always results in a slightly rough surface, so sanding off those rough edges is a good idea at this point. And now it's time to paint the exposed chipboard. I'm just using extremely cheap acrylic craft paint for this process. Now, before we begin the bronze inlay, we need to put down a protective coating on the surface of our miniature. And for this, I'm just using candle wax melted onto a disposable piece of smooth fabric. And I'm then wiping that melted candle wax into the surface. This is going to help prevent the super glue and bronze powder from penetrating into our paper layers. Please take proper precautions when using metal powders. That means protecting your lungs with some kind of particulate screening mask. This bronze powder is intended for uses like this, and it works very well with a thin superglue. I've just got a little scoop and a flat-sided palette knife to help me apply and smooth out this extremely finely ground powder. Here I'm working over a nonstick craft sheet so that I can collect any of the fine powder that falls off the edge of my piece and put it back into the main container. This stuff is precious and I don't want to waste any more than is absolutely necessary. The goal here is to make certain that the powder fills all of the voids in the surface of your panel. And the next step is to impregnate the surface with your thin superglue. This is going to penetrate down through all the layers of fine powder and create an incredibly durable bronze finish in those declivities. Now this process gets repeated for all of the panels that have decorative overlays. Bronze powder is applied and then thin superglue is spread over the top, and every attempt is made to fill all of the voids evenly with the bronze powder. If you find that it has sunk down a bit below the surface, add more and harden that with superglue. Once these have fully cured, and it won't take long, less than an hour, it's time to begin the sanding process, and you will need an electric sander of some variety in order to make this as painless a process as possible. Again, make certain to use a dust mask. You don't want to be breathing any of the particulate that's generated through this process. In theory, the layer of candle wax that was applied prior to adding the bronze powder is intended to make this part of the removal a little bit easier. I personally couldn't tell that it made that much of a difference, but after having done extensive research on the process, I thought anything that would potentially help to reduce the amount of damage to the upper surface as we're sanding away is a good thing. So I do recommend that you add the candle wax. Some areas of your surface may prove to be a little more stubborn than others, and you may find that you've sanded down into the layers of cardstock a bit further than you would have liked, resulting in this weathered sort of texture. Now, personally, I find that appealing, and I love the aura of authenticity that it gives the final piece. But if you don't like that, you can take the time to go back and repaint over any areas of the black cardstock that appear to have been damaged by the sanding process. Once the panels have all been sanded and are smooth, it's time to construct the cabinet. And we're going to follow precisely the same procedure as was demonstrated earlier with the raised stenciling version of the cabinet. You'll want to dry fit both the side and the top and bottom panels against the back panel before beginning the glue up process, and make sure that everything is oriented correctly before you get started. Again, remember to add the side panels and the top panel only at this stage, and then allow the construction to cure. Inspect the piece, Make certain that everything is going according to plan, and then position each of the cabinet doors so that the tiny spindle at the top edge of each door is inserted into the receiving hole in the top panel. Apply your adhesive and then affix the bottom panel into place. Make sure the little spindles fit into the holes in the bottom panel. Press everything firmly together. Verify that everything looks straight and true. And once you're satisfied, give the piece a little bit of support and allow the adhesive to cure. I chose to do a little bit of embellishing on the interior of this version of the cabinet. So I'm taking the shelf panel and I'm going to apply a little remnant of red velvet that I had lying around. This is easy to do, and I just love the sumptuous feel that it gives the interior of the cabinet. A thin layer of PVA glue is applied to the shelf panel, and then this is pressed into the reverse side of the velvet remnant. Without having to wait for the adhesive to cure, you can go ahead and remove the excess fabric with a pair of scissors. To neaten up all of the edges, an emery board does a wonderful job. It may result in a few loose fibers hanging, but we'll take care of that in just a moment. Make sure to snip away the tiny bits of fabric covering those divots at the outer edges of the shelf panel. And then, if you have any strings, just quickly burn them away with an open flame. I glued some decorative papers onto the interior as well. And I'm just following the exact same procedure for installing the shelf onto the shelf supports and putting in that central panel. Now, once all this has had an opportunity to cure, I take a few moments to neaten up the exterior of the upper cabinet with an emery board. I just want to make sure that all those edges are smooth. And now it's time to construct the legs, or the lower portion of the cabinet. And again, I'm doing this in two sections, with one front piece and one side piece glued together and allowed to cure. While I'm waiting for those to dry, I'll layer together 8 of these internal panels and use them to align the molding frames for the bottom of the piece. I just fit that inside of the larger frame and then fit the smaller frame right on top. This leaves those alignment tabs exposed so that when the time comes to add the legs to the piece, they will be perfectly slotted into that. And I'll repeat the procedure for the upper molding frames, centering the smaller on top of the larger and allowing that to cure. Now I'm assembling the lower portion of the cabinet by placing glue on 2 of the exposed edges and fitting together the other half of the lower portion. And removing any squeeze out. There. We'll let that set up. Once it has, it's time to install the lower shelf and or spacing panel. Again, this just gets fitted through a pressure fit, And when you're happy with its placement, simply add adhesive to the exterior and smooth away any excess. Now the piece is going to be very, very secure. And I just love the way that bronze gleams from that bottom shelf. Now we're going to add the alignment frame, placing a generous amount of adhesive, lining up the tabs and slots, and pressing everything firmly into place. While that's setting up, let's install the hardware on the doors. Take your time here and make certain that you're happy with the alignment of all of the pieces. Don't worry if you get a little bit of PVA squeezing out between the door panels. You'll be able to clear that away. Just gently open the doors and scrape away any excess glue. And now it's time to put it all together. I'm adding a generous amount of solvent-based adhesive to the bottom of the main cabinet, and then aligning it to the best of my ability with the lower portion of the cabinet. And then adding the upper molding frames. Let's let it cure. And now the construction is complete. Just a few finishing touches. I'm going to use this metallic pen to call out some of the detail on the tiny handles. I want it to be relatively muted, so after I apply the gold ink, I'm touching it with my fingertip to dull down the finish just slightly. There, I like that effect. And now it's time for final finishes. I chose to use shellac. The goal here is to make certain that the surface is protected and that the bronze isn't subject to oxidization, so a protective layer is strongly advised. I love working with shellac. It's so easy to apply and it dries almost instantaneously. Here I'm just using a cosmetic sponge to apply a very thin layer, and it's almost dry by the time I've finished adding it. Just lovely. And the resulting finish is amazing to the touch. Because the shellac is so easy to work with and it doesn't leave a heavy plasticky buildup, you can add many, many layers within just a few minutes. I love this soft sheen. Just gorgeous. I'll just open the cabinet doors and allow that to cure. It won't take long. And that, my friends, is that. It's been a wonderful experience learning to work with both the raised stencils in miniature form and this exquisite bronze inlay technique. I hope that you've enjoyed it as well. As always, thank you so much for hanging out with me today. Until next time, bye.